The 15th of November, 1315. Before sunrise, the eastern shore of Lake Egery, in the heart of the Swiss Alps. The water is black and still. A thin layer of ice has formed along the reeds at the waterline. The air carries the kind of cold that gets inside metal, the kind that makes armor feel like a coffin. On a narrow road pressed between the steep face of Morgarten mountain and the edge of that frozen lake, a column of men is moving south. They have been marching since before midnight. The column stretches back so far that the men at the rear cannot see the men at the front. They can only follow. The road allows nothing else. At the head of this column rides Duke Leopold I of Austria. He is 25 years old. He commands one of the most formidable armies assembled in Central Europe in a generation, more than 2,000 mounted knights in plate armor, supplemented by thousands of infantry from Habsburg-controlled territories across the region. His horses are war horses, bred for battle. His knights have trained their entire lives for this kind of campaign. They are here to crush a rebellion. The target is a cluster of farming communities in the mountains ahead, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, 3 small cantons that had the audacity to defy Habsburg authority, raid a monastery under Habsburg protection, and align themselves with the wrong claimant to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Leopold has come to remind them who is in charge of these mountains. He expects this to be quick. On the slope above the road, a steep forested rise called the Figlen Flue, there is no sound, no movement, nothing visible in the dark trees, except that there are approximately 1,500 to 2,000 men up there. They have been waiting since before the Habsburgs left Zug. They are not knights, they are not professional soldiers. Many of them are farmers, stonecutters, and herders who have lived their entire lives in these mountains. They do not have plate armor. They carry halberds, pole weapons with an axe blade, a thrusting spike, and a hook. And they carry something simpler: rocks and logs. What Leopold does not know, cannot know, is that the road he is marching his army down is not a route. It is a trap. Not a trap that was sprung on him by chance. A trap built for him deliberately, patiently, with a precise understanding of the one thing his enormous army cannot survive, a space too narrow to fight in. In the next 2 hours, more than 1,500 of his soldiers will die, some cut down by halberds, some crushed by boulders rolling down the slope at speed, some drowned in the freezing water of Lake Egery, pushed off the road in the chaos, their armor pulling them under before they can remove it. Leopold himself will survive barely by fighting his way through his own panicking men. And when it is over, the world will be slightly different than it was before. This video is not about the bravery of the Swiss, though they were brave. It is not about the arrogance of the Habsburgs, though they were arrogant. It is about something more specific and more instructive than either of those things. It is about the fact that on the 15th of November, 1315, a group of farmers with rocks and pole weapons did something that should not have been possible according to every military logic of the age, and they did it not through luck or miracle, but through the precise application of one idea. Make your enemy fight in a place where their greatest strength becomes useless. That idea, worked out in a mountain pass by men who had no formal military education, would go on to reshape how armies fought across all of Europe for the next 200 years. But before we can understand what happened on that road, we have to understand why it happened. We have to understand the world Leopold came from, the world these Swiss communities were fighting to preserve, and the very specific sequence of decisions and provocations that funneled an entire Habsburg army into a killing ground they never saw coming. To understand Morgarten, you have to understand a pass. Not the Morgarten Pass itself, not yet. You have to understand the Gotthard Pass, because everything that happened in 1315 traces back, one way or another, to a single road through the Alps that connected the commercial world of northern Europe to the commercial world of Italy. By the late 13th century, the Gotthard route was one of the most economically significant corridors on the continent. Silver from German mines flowed south. Silk and spices from Mediterranean trade networks flowed north. The tolls collected along that route represented enormous wealth. And the communities that sat at the northern end of the Gotthard, 3 small farming cantons in what we now call central Switzerland, occupied a geographic position that no amount of military power could simply conjure elsewhere. Uri controlled key access to the pass itself. Schwyz sat along approach routes. Unterwalden anchored the western approaches to the lake country that led to the mountains. Together, these 3 communities were not wealthy. They were not powerful in the conventional sense, but they were located where they were located. And in medieval Europe, location could sometimes substitute for all other forms of power, if you were willing to fight for it. The House of Habsburg had understood this for decades. They wanted control of the Gotthard corridor, and control of the corridor meant, eventually, control of the communities that sat on top of it. This tension had been building for a long time. But it reached a critical moment in 1291, when Emperor Rudolf I of Habsburg died. His death created a power vacuum, and in that vacuum, the 3 forest cantons moved quickly. Representatives of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden gathered and signed what historians call the Federal Charter, a mutual defense pact. If any one of them was attacked, the others were obligated to come to their defense. It is important not to romanticize this document too much. It was not a declaration of independence. It was not a philosophical statement about freedom or the rights of common people. It was, at its heart, a very practical agreement made by communities that understood their own vulnerability. Alone, each of them could be picked off. Together, an attack on one required the attacker to fight all 3. Modern historians have also noted something worth mentioning honestly. The version of this document that sits in Swiss archives today is almost certainly not the original text from 1291. It is likely a copy made sometime after 1390, updated to remain relevant to the political language of a later period. The original agreement almost certainly existed, but the legendary weight placed on this moment was largely constructed in later centuries by historians working to give the Swiss Confederation an origin story worthy of its eventual significance. What the pact did create, reliably, demonstrably, was a precedent, a habit of collective action. And that habit would prove worth more than any amount of armor when the real crisis came. The crisis arrived gradually, then suddenly. In 1313, Emperor Henry VII died. Now 2 men were claiming his throne simultaneously. One was Frederick of Habsburg, the Fair, they called him, though the nickname tells you more about his appearance than his character. The other was Louis of Bavaria. The imperial electors were divided. Europe was watching. For the 3 forest cantons, this was not an abstract political drama. It was an immediate existential question. Frederick of Habsburg was the heir to the dynasty that had been trying to absorb their territory for a generation. If he became emperor, the cantons could expect renewed and intensified pressure to submit. If Louis of Bavaria won, the situation was at least open less certain, but less immediately threatening. The cantons chose Louis. It was not a sentimental choice. It was the obvious strategic calculation of communities that had been watching the Habsburgs encircle them for 30 years. This put them on the wrong side of a very dangerous man. Frederick's brother was Leopold I of Austria. Young, ambitious, deeply invested in Habsburg prestige. He had already led one failed military campaign against Louis's forces. He had watched his brother's political position weaken. He needed a win. He needed to demonstrate to everyone watching that challenging Habsburg authority would carry consequences. Then, in the early hours of the 6th of January 1314, the men of Schwyz gave him his pretext. The details of what happened that night at Einsiedeln Abbey are not entirely clear across the sources. What is agreed upon, a force from Swiss, reportedly led by Werner Stauffacher, raided the abbey. They broke through the gates, they took valuables, they desecrated the church and seized several monks as hostages. The reason for this raid was, at its root, a dispute over pasture rights. Swiss had a long-running conflict with Einsiedeln over who had the right to graze livestock on certain mountain meadows. In a community where the difference between adequate grazing land and insufficient grazing land could determine whether families survived the winter, these disputes were deadly serious. But the timing and method were, to put it charitably, catastrophically unwise. Because Einsiedeln Abbey was under the formal protection of the Habsburgs. Attacking it was not merely a crime against the church, it was a direct challenge to Leopold's authority as protector of that institution. The bishop extended excommunication to all three cantons immediately. In the medieval world, this was not merely a religious censure. It meant the cantons were legally and spiritually outside the community of Christendom. No one was obligated to honor contracts with them, trade with them, or refrain from attacking them. It was, in effect, placing a target on their backs. Leopold began assembling his army. Modern historians who have studied this campaign carefully note that his motivation was more sophisticated than simple revenge. Leopold's position depended on the credibility of Habsburg protection. If he did not respond to the Einsiedeln raid, if he allowed the cantons to violate a Habsburg protectorate without consequence, then every lord, abbot, and town in his sphere of influence would understand that his promises were hollow. In the political economy of feudalism, that kind of credibility collapse was not just embarrassing, it was existential. He had to come. The only question was how. By late October 1315, he had gathered his forces at Zug. Contemporary chronicles put the numbers absurdly high, one monk writing a figure of 20,000 men, a number modern military historians dismiss on logistical grounds. The mountainous terrain, the season, and the supply constraints of the period make anything like that number essentially impossible. More careful analysis estimates somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 total, with the core combat force being around 2,000 mounted knights backed by several thousand infantry drawn from various Habsburg territories. What seems clear beyond dispute is that this was a serious, professional fighting force far more powerful by every conventional measure than anything the three cantons could put in the field. The cantons knew this. They were not unaware of the army assembling at their doorstep. The smoke of campfires, the movement of columns, the sound of thousands of men and horses cannot be hidden in mountain country. So what did the men of Schwyz do when they saw the most powerful military force the region had seen in living memory preparing to march against them? They started looking at the road along Lake Egery. And one of them, no chronicle, preserves the specific moment of recognition, looked at that narrow strip of ground between the mountain and the water, and understood something that Leopold did not. That road was not a passage, it was a coffin. There is a concept in military thinking ancient, intuitive, and frequently ignored by those who should know better, that the most important weapon in any engagement is not the one you carry in your hand. It is the ground beneath your feet. The men of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden did not have a military academy. They did not have trained officers who had studied campaigns in Latin manuscripts. What they had was something worth more in the specific circumstances of November 1315. They knew these mountains the way you know, the inside of your own house. They had walked these paths in all weather, in all seasons, since childhood. They understood the geometry of the landscape not as a map, but as a living thing, where the slopes steepen, where the water collects, where a man on foot can move fast, and where a horse cannot move at all. And the road along Lake Egery was a place they understood with particular clarity. Let me describe it precisely, because the terrain is not incidental to what happened. It is the entire explanation. The southern end of Lake Egery empties into a marshy lowland. The road from Zug to Schwyz running south along the eastern shore of the lake, passes through a section where the eastern slope rises sharply the Figlernfluh, a steep rock and forest face, and the western edge of the road drops immediately into water and swamp. There is no shoulder. There is no room to step aside. The road is wide enough, in some sections, for perhaps 2 horses abreast, in others, a single column. For a traveller or merchant, this road is merely narrow and unpleasant. For an army of mounted knights, it is something else entirely. Medieval cavalry, specifically the heavy armoured knights that formed the shock force of any serious feudal army in this period, derived all of their effectiveness from a very specific combination of speed, mass, and space. A charging knight in full plate, mounted on a trained warhorse, was an almost irresistible force in the right conditions. Those conditions required room to build momentum, room to form into line, and room to maneuver when that line met resistance. Take any one of those 3 things away, and the horse becomes a liability rather than an advantage. Take all 3 away, and a knight on horseback is simply a heavily encumbered man who cannot run. On the road along Lake Egery, all 3 were impossible. The men planning the defence understood this. Their problem was not how to fight 2,000 knights in open battle that was not survivable. Their problem was how to ensure the battle never happened in open ground at all. How to force Leopold's army into the one place in the region where his cavalry was not just neutralized, but actively endangered. The planning, as historians can reconstruct it from fragmentary sources, involved several interconnected decisions. None of them were complicated. All of them were precise. First, the approach. Leopold's army marched from Zug. There were multiple possible routes into Schwyz. The road through Arth along the western shore of Lake Zug was perhaps the most direct. Why Leopold chose the Egersee route instead has been debated. Some historians suggest the Arth route may have been blocked or defended in a way that made it unattractive. Others argue that Leopold may have deliberately chosen this approach as an unexpected direction, a backdoor maneuver intended to catch the defenders off guard. If so, the irony is profound. He chose the unexpected route in order to surprise his enemy. And his enemy was waiting for him on that exact road. The main Swiss force, approximately 1,500 men from Schwyz, 200 from Uri, and smaller contingents from Unterwalden, positioned themselves on the forested slope of the Figlernfluh above the road. They chose their position carefully, high enough to have gravitational advantage, close enough to engage in direct combat after the initial bombardment. Before concealing themselves, they placed a barrier across the road at the southern end of the kill zone. Not an elaborate fortification, sources suggest it was a relatively simple blockade of logs and debris. Its purpose was not to stop the army, it was to slow the army, to cause the head of the column to pause, to bunch up, to mill in confusion at exactly the point where the slope above was steepest and the water beside it was closest. Then they waited. Now, let us talk about the weapons, because they tell you something important about the people who used them. The halberd, the primary weapon of the Swiss infantry at Morgarten, was not a weapon of elegance. It was a weapon of brutal pragmatism. The design combined 3 functional elements: a broad axe blade capable of cutting through chainmail or biting through gaps in plate armor, a thrusting spike at the top for stabbing, and a hook at the rear of the blade. That hook is the most underappreciated element of the design. In close combat against a mounted opponent, the hook was used to catch the edge of a saddle, a leg, a piece of armor, and drag the rider from his horse. Once a knight was on the ground, in a confined space with mud and chaos around him, all of his armor became a prison. He could not stand quickly. He could not run. He was suddenly the most vulnerable man on the field. And then there were the rocks. In written histories, this detail sometimes gets treated almost apologetically, as if rolling stones and logs down a hill is too crude, too primitive to merit serious tactical analysis. That impression is wrong. The boulders and logs that the Swiss positioned on the Figlernfluh above the road were force multipliers. A stone of 50 pounds, rolling down a 30-degree slope from 30 meters above a road, arrives at the road with enough momentum to stave in a horse's skull or shatter the front ranks of a tightly packed column. Stones do not need to aim. A dozen rocks rolled into a dense column of men and horses do not need to hit individual targets. They need only to create chaos. Because chaos, in a column that cannot spread out and cannot retreat, does the rest of the work. The panic of horses is a detail that deserves its own moment. War horses in this period were trained to tolerate noise, to hold their footing under fire, to move toward rather than away from threats. They were, by the standards of their era, extraordinarily well-conditioned animals, but they were not conditioned for this, not for boulders falling from the sky in a space where they could not turn around. When a horse panics in an open field, it runs. When a horse panics on a 12-foot wide road with a mountain on one side and a lake on the other, it becomes a 1,500-pound obstacle actively trying to kill the people around it. Leopold's cavalry would not fail at Morgarten because the Swiss were stronger or faster. They would fail because the road made the horses dangerous. There is one more element of the preparation that needs to be considered the most important and most overlooked. It is the decision about where to place the barrier. The Swiss did not place their barrier at the very entrance to the narrow section of road. If they had, the Habsburg vanguard, the lead cavalry element of the column, would have encountered it before entering the kill zone, and the army might have had the option of falling back before the trap closed. Instead, the barrier was positioned far enough into the narrows that the vanguard had already passed through the most dangerous section before the main force was fully committed. When the trap was sprung, the vanguard found themselves ahead of the barrier, effectively separated from the chaos behind them, removed from the decisive battle. The main body of the army, the largest and densest portion of the column, was caught in the kill zone. This detail has been argued over by military historians. Some believe the vanguard's separation was intentional, a deliberate decision by the Swiss to allow the front element to pass through, ensuring the densest possible mass of men was caught beneath the slope. Others believe it was a partial miscalculation that happened to work in the defenders' favor. What is certain is that the effect stripped the Habsburg force of its forward command structure at the moment when command was most needed. Count Wilhelm II von Montfort-Tétang commanded the Habsburg vanguard. He would not survive the morning. According to a 15th-century Swiss chronicle, which should be taken as atmosphere rather than confirmed fact, Leopold gathered his nobles to discuss the plan of attack and even asked his court jester for an opinion. The fool reportedly replied, "My lords, you have spent much time debating how to get into that country. I notice none of you have debated how to get out." Whether or not that exchange happened, it captures something real about the situation. Leopold was planning for a victory. He was not planning for a retreat. He had not imagined a scenario in which retreat was necessary. That was his most consequential error. He had assembled an army, committed to a campaign, staked his political credibility on a show of force. Every lord and city in his sphere was watching. To march to Zug and return without crossing into Schwyz would have been a humiliation from which his authority might never recover. The political cost of not fighting was, in his calculation, greater than the military risk of fighting. He was right about one of those calculations. The column moved south. The road narrowed. The moonlight faded as dawn approached. The slope of the Figlernfluh rose above them, dark and silent. And on that slope, 1,500 men in the cold were waiting, watching the column emerge from the northern end of the narrows. Phase 1. The column enters before dawn. November 15. They came in moonlight first. The vanguard of the Habsburg column heavy cavalry, the lords and knights who traditionally rode at the front of any feudal army, moved into the narrowing road along Lake Egery sometime in the early hours before dawn. The column behind them stretched back north along the lakeshore. At the speed of a marching army, with thousands of men and horses on a road barely wide enough for a cart, the rear elements were still miles back when the front reached the killing ground. This was normal. This was how armies moved. The vanguard was supposed to be separated from the main body it pushed forward, identified obstacles, cleared the way, or sent word back. The distance between front and rear was a tactical feature, not a vulnerability. In open country, in the narrows of Morgarten, it was the first element of disaster. The vanguard moved through. The road compressed around them, rock face to the east, water to the west, and then opened slightly as they emerged into a broader section on the southern side of the kill zone. They kept moving. They were not the target. Behind them, the main body of the army was fully committed to the narrow road. Thousands of men and horses in a column that could not spread out, could not turn around without the entire rear backing up through the darkness. The mounted knights in the body of the column rode compressed not by enemy pressure, but by geography. Saddle to saddle, horse flanks, almost touching, the sound of hooves magnified by the rock face to their right. The slope above them was invisible in the pre-dawn dark. The trees on the Figlernfluh were shadows within shadows. If anyone in that column looked up, and someone must have, they would have seen nothing. The Swiss on the slope looked down and saw everything. First light. Perhaps 5 or 6 in the morning. The column is fully in the narrows. On the road ahead, the leading elements of the main body encountered the barrier. It was not impressive. Not a wall, not a fortification, not a line of spears, logs and debris across the road. The kind of blockage that, on any other road in any other context, a few men with axes could clear in 10 minutes. But it served its purpose with mechanical precision. It made the column stop, and a column that stops on a narrow road does not stand at attention. It bunches. The men at the front halt. The men behind them do not know why, and continue moving forward. The distance between soldiers closes. Within minutes, thousands of men are packed into a section of road with no room to draw weapons, no room to turn horses, and no room to retreat. Leopold received the report from the front. Blocked road, unknown force, unclear strength. He had to decide. He decided that this was a delaying tactic, a small force trying to slow his advance, while the main body of the cantons organized a defense elsewhere. He ordered the knights at the front of his main formation to dismount and clear the barrier. To deal with what he believed was a minor obstruction. They dismounted. They moved toward the barrier. They were looking forward. No one was looking up. Phase 2. The first strike. Rocks, logs, and the sound of falling. The sound came before anything else. Not a shout, not a horn, not the clash of weapons. The first sound was almost geological, a low, grinding rumble from the slope above, followed immediately by a cracking, splintering impact as the first rocks struck the road. The stones came down the face of the Figlernfluh at speed. Not thrown rolled, pushed from where Swiss fighters had positioned them hours before. As they bounced and accelerated down the rock face, they did not maintain neat trajectories. They caromed off outcroppings, split into fragments, changed direction unpredictably. By the time they reached the road, they were not individual projectiles. They were a chaos of mass and velocity, arriving simultaneously across a 30-foot section of the column. The horses reacted first. A warhorse trained to hold formation under the noise of battle is still an animal with an animal's brain, and the animal's brain has one response to something heavy and fast falling from the sky, in a space where there is nowhere to run: terror. The horses in the central mass of the column began rearing. When a horse rears in an open field, the rider has options: rein, spur, seat. When a horse rears in a 12-foot corridor with other horses pressed on 3 sides, there are no options. The horse goes over, or it goes sideways, and either way it takes everything around it. In the space of perhaps 2 minutes, the careful military order of the Habsburg column began to dissolve. Not yet into rout, not yet into the full chaos that would come, but the tight formation of armored knights that had been marching in disciplined file was now a mass of animals in panic and men trying with diminishing success to control them. And the rocks were still coming. The men pushed over the edge of the road, not many, not yet, but some found themselves in the shallow water of Lake Egery's edge or in the marshy ground south of the road. In early November, in the Alps, the water temperature was close to freezing. A man in full plate armor who falls into chest-deep water in near-freezing conditions has a very short time before hypothermia and the weight of his gear make movement impossible. Some of them found this out directly. On the slope above, the Swiss fighters were watching the column. They could see the horses bucking, the formation compressing further at the front where men pushed back against the blockage, the chaos spreading backward through the column as the rocks continued to fall. They could see that the moment had come. The halberds came off shoulders. Men began to move. Perhaps 15 minutes into the engagement, first grey light of dawn on the water. PHEAs 3. The descent. When gravity became a weapon, they came down the slope fast. This is one of those details that requires a moment to appreciate fully. The Swiss fighters descending from the Figlenfluh were not charging across flat ground. They were running downhill, through trees and rocks, on terrain they knew, toward men who had just been hit by boulders and could not organize a response. Gravity, which had already done the first stage of the work with the rocks, was now doing the second stage. It was accelerating the attackers while the defenders were still trying to understand what was happening. Consider the asymmetry of that moment. On the road below, armored men on panicking horses in a confined space, no room to form up, visibility obscured by confusion, command structure fragmenting as the forward elements were cut off by the barrier and the chaos behind them. Above them, men moving fast down a familiar slope, armed with weapons specifically designed for close-quarter fighting against armored opponents, arriving at the road with the momentum of the hill behind them. The halberd at close range against a dismounted knight is not a subtle contest. The axe blade could bite through the gap between gorget and helmet, between breastplate and tasset the joints and seams of armor that a skilled opponent knew how to find. But in the chaos of Morgarten, finesse was not required. The heavy weight of the halberd head, swung with both hands, and the additional force of downhill momentum could collapse chainmail, buckle plate, fracture bone through steel. The men on the receiving end were already off balance, already struggling with their horses, already being pushed from behind by men who had not yet understood what was happening at the front. And then there was the hook. The rear hook of the halberd was designed for one specific purpose: to catch a rider and pull him down. In open battle, this maneuver required considerable skill timing. A lunge at a moving horse, catching a specific piece of armor, maintaining grip against the horse's momentum. At Morgarten, the horses were barely moving. The knights in the middle of the column were standing nearly still, surrounded on 3 sides, trying to manage animals that wanted desperately to go somewhere and had nowhere to go. The hooks found purchase. Knights came out of saddles and hit the road. A man in full plate armor, weighing, with the armor itself, perhaps 400 pounds, falls hard. He does not bounce up immediately. He lies there perhaps a long moment while the battle swirls around him. In that moment, on that particular road, the Swiss fighters were already moving to the next man. Up and down the column, this scene was repeating. The noise was overwhelming, the screaming of horses, the clash of metal, the roar of men fighting in close quarters, the continuing sound of rocks and debris rolling down the slope. In a narrow corridor, sound reflects off the stone walls and amplifies. Men 40 yards back in the column, who could not yet see what was happening, could hear everything, and what they heard was unmistakably a catastrophe unfolding at the front. Perhaps 30 minutes into the engagement, full dawn now, the column is no longer a column. PHEAs 4. The breaking point, Leopold loses command. There is a military concept that historians rarely apply explicitly to this period, but that perfectly describes what was happening in the Habsburg column: cascading command failure. Command in a medieval army was hierarchical and personal. It depended on lords giving orders directly to their men, on the chain of authority running through personal allegiance. When the top held, the chain held. When the top was compromised, the chain unravelled quickly and could not be reattached from the middle. Count Wilhelm II von Montfort-Tétang commanded the Habsburg vanguard. He was one of the most senior military figures in the column, an experienced lord from a powerful family in the Habsburg sphere. He died in the initial assault, along with most of the men under his direct command. The loss of the vanguard commander severed the front of the command chain at the moment when coordination between the advance element and the main body might have organized some kind of response. Leopold was further back in the column. He was alive. He was trying to issue orders. But issuing orders in the noise and confusion of that road, with panicking horses between him and his officers, with no clear picture of what was happening 50 yards in front of him, was an exercise in futility. Orders that left his mouth may have reached the men immediately beside him. They did not reach the front. The front was already beyond orders. What could he order in any case? He could not order a charge. There was no room. He could not order flanking movement. There were no flanks. He could not order an organized retreat. The men behind him were still pressing forward, unaware of the disaster ahead. Any command to fall back would have required the rear of the column to understand, quickly and calmly, that they needed to reverse course on a narrow road in the dark, while the men in the middle were screaming. That kind of coordinated withdrawal requires exactly the kind of discipline that evaporates when men believe they are about to die. The men in the rear began to hear the sounds. They began to see men running back toward them, not in formation, not in disciplined retreat, but in the blind, individual flight of people who had stopped being soldiers and started being humans trying to survive. When a man running from the front of a disaster reaches the rear of a column and reports in whatever fragmentary, terrified language men use in that moment that the front is catastrophic, the rear does not usually form up neatly and prepare a defensive position. The rear begins to consider the distance between itself and safety. Leopold saw this happening. He tried to rally men around him. Accounts from the period, none of them eyewitness, all of them written years or decades later, suggest that he was not without personal courage. He did not flee immediately. He tried. But the column was no longer a military formation. It was a crowd of armed, terrified men on a road with nowhere to go. Perhaps 45 minutes to an hour into the engagement, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Phase 5. Route, pursuit, and the cold water. The moment a military rout begins, the moment it tips from fighting retreat to running panic, is almost impossible to identify precisely. It is not one man deciding to run. It is a threshold the group crosses, collectively and without deliberation, when the shared belief that the situation can be survived by fighting is replaced by the shared belief that the situation can only be survived by leaving. At Morgarten, that threshold was crossed sometime in the first hour. The Habsburg column dissolved from the front backward. The men who had been fighting at the point of contact with the Swiss broke first, those who could still move, who had not been unhorsed or injured, who found a gap in the mass of bodies around them. They did not run in any particular direction. They ran away from the halberds, away from the rocks, away from the sound. For some of them, away meant into the water. The road along Lake Egery is narrow. The lake edge is close. In the crush and chaos of a rout on a narrow road, men get pushed sideways as well as backward. Those pushed sideways stepped off the edge into the marshy ground along the lake, or directly into the shallow water near the shore. In early November in the Alps, the water temperature would have been close to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, cold enough to cause rapid muscle impairment. Men in plate armor do not swim. Men in chainmail do not swim easily. Even men who managed to remove a piece of armor before going in would have found the cold working against them before they reached anything solid. The Swiss fighters had not stopped with the initial assault. They had advanced down the road from the point of contact, keeping pressure on men who were trying to run. Sources from this period, none of them contemporary, all requiring careful handling, suggest that the pursuit was merciless. This detail has been noted by historians with a particular edge of discomfort, because it violates the conventions of chivalric warfare that theoretically governed conflicts between knights in this era. Those conventions, in their own logic, applied when both parties recognized each other as belonging to the same social and moral order. Knights took other knights prisoner and ransomed them because this was profitable and because it was the established code of the caste. The men of Swiss and Uri did not see themselves as members of that caste. They were not fighting according to the rules of tournaments or feudal obligation. They were fighting for their land, their communities, and the survival of a way of life that the army marching toward them directly threatened. They killed. They kept killing. The pursuit ran for some distance back along the road toward Zug. The total duration of the engagement, from the first rocks rolling down the Figlen Flue to the last Habsburg soldiers clearing the Narrows in flight, was probably less than 2 hours. In that time, the most powerful military force that had entered the region in a generation had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Leopold escaped. He fought his way out, literally, through his own men, those who were still standing, still panicking, still blocking the road between him and the exit. He reached Zug. He was alive. He had lost his army. He had lost his knights. He had lost the campaign he had staked his political authority on. And perhaps worst of all, he had lost it to the people everyone in his world had agreed were not worth losing to. There is a particular quality to a battlefield after an overwhelming defeat, a quality different from the aftermath of a close, hard-fought engagement. When a battle is close, the field carries a certain grim equality in its dead. Both sides paid, and both sides know it. When a battle is overwhelming, when one side has simply ceased to exist as a coherent force, the field tells a different story. A story of flight and pursuit, of armor abandoned because it was too heavy to run in, of weapons dropped in the road. A story of 1,000 individual moments when a man made a decision to stand, to run, to drop his sword, and those individual moments, multiplied across an army, add up to something that historians will spend years trying to explain. The road along Lake Egery, on the afternoon of the 15th of November, 1315, told that story. The armor scattered along the northern end of the pass was not the armor of men who had chosen to surrender. In the culture of 14th century chivalric warfare, surrendering to an enemy who might ransom you was an accepted, even rational, act. But these men had not been offered the option of surrender. They had dropped their gear while running, because the gear was slowing them down. The knights who had come to Morgarten in the finest armor money could buy found in the crisis that the thing supposed to protect them had become the thing killing them. The lake held the rest. The shallow water along the eastern shore was the destination of those pushed off the road in the crush of the rout. The bodies there would not be recovered in any organized way. The autumn cold would prevent immediate decomposition, but the remote location and the disrupted political situation would make systematic burial impossible for some time. What the lake held, it held. Leopold reached Zug sometime that morning. The accounts we have of his return are not detailed, no chronicle focused closely on his specific movements and emotional state in the immediate aftermath, and we should be skeptical of any reconstruction that claims to know exactly what he felt or said. What we can reconstruct from the political record is the shape of what he faced. He had come to the region commanding one of the most formidable military forces in the area. He was returning without it. Every lord, town mayor, monastery abbot, and merchant within 100 miles, who had been watching to see how this campaign unfolded, now had their answer. The Habsburgs had marched on the forest cantons. and the forest cantons had won, decisively, publicly, in a way that could not be explained away as a skirmish or a partial setback. The immediate political consequences cascaded outward from that fact. The towns and territories that had been wavering in their alignment, places formerly within the Habsburg sphere, but watching the tension between the cantons and the dynasty with strategic interest, now had new information to incorporate. The calculus of who it was safer to antagonize had shifted in ways that would take months and years to fully play out. Leopold did not give up. He never gave up, entirely, on the project of reasserting Habsburg authority in the region. He would attempt further campaigns in subsequent years. But those campaigns would be conducted against a different enemy, one that had just proven it could not be intimidated into submission. 9 days after the battle, Leopold formally acknowledged a ceasefire with the cantons. The ceasefire was a practical acknowledgement of reality more than a genuine peace. It bought time for everyone to assess what had happened and decide what to do next. And in Brunnen, the surviving fighters of the 3 cantons were gathering. The 9th of December, 1315. Less than a month after the battle, representatives of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden met at Brunnen, on the southern shore of Lake Lucerne, and signed what historians call the Pact of Brunnen. To understand the significance of this document, you need to understand one specific detail that is easy to overlook. It was written in German. Not Latin, German. In the medieval world, Latin was the language of the church, of imperial administration, of formal legal instruments that derived their authority from connection to the Roman tradition. When an institution wrote something important in Latin, they were signaling that they were operating within that larger framework, acknowledging the authority of the structures that Latin represented. German was the language of the communities themselves, the language people actually spoke in these valleys and on these mountains. Writing the renewed alliance in German was not a neutral administrative choice. It was a declaration, made without being explicitly stated, that this agreement derived its authority not from the Roman imperial tradition or the church hierarchy, but from the communities themselves. And within this German language document, for the first time in any formal text connected to these communities, a word appears that will eventually name an entire nation. Eidgenosse. The word translates literally as oath fellow, someone bound to you by an oath, a sworn confederate, not subject of the emperor, not vassal of the Lord. An Eidgenoss was someone who had sworn the same oath as you, and to whom you were bound by that oath in mutual obligation. It was a new political identity, not imposed from above, not inherited from feudal obligation, but chosen, created by the act of swearing together. The men who signed the Pact of Brunnen did not know they were naming a nation. They were doing something far more immediate and practical, making sure that what had happened at Morgarten had not happened for nothing, making sure the alliance held. The founding document that Swiss children would eventually learn about in school, the document that would come to symbolize the birth of Switzerland, was written by survivors of a massacre in the language of their own communities, less than 4 weeks after the most consequential morning of their lives. History does not announce its turning points in advance. The men who fought at Morgarten did not know they were standing at the beginning of something that would outlast every kingdom and dynasty involved in the dispute. They knew the names of their neighbors, the depth of the winter cold on Lake Egery. Cowby, the larger arc of what they had set in motion was not visible to them, not in the hours after the battle, not in the days it took to sign the Pact of Brunnen, but that arc was real. Start with the military consequences, because they are the most direct. At Morgarten, the Swiss learned something precise, that a man without armor, carrying a halberd 2 meters long, could kill an armored knight in the right terrain, with the right preparation. This was not theoretical. It was demonstrated fact, witnessed by thousands, absorbed into the military thinking of a generation. They adapted. The halberd was effective in confined terrain, but shorter than a cavalry lance. On open ground, a line of halberdiers would be reached before they could respond. The answer was the pike, a shaft between 4 and 5.5 meters, tipped with steel. No cavalry lance in this period was longer. A formation of pike-armed men, trained to hold their ground, created a hedge that no horse would willingly enter. From the pike came the pike square, the tactical formation that would define European warfare for the next 2 centuries. A dense block of infantry armed with pikes projecting outward in every direction, capable of both offensive advance and defensive stand. The Swiss refined it over decades of fighting at Laupen, Sempach and Neffels. By the late 14th century, they were recognized as the most formidable infantry force in Europe. Other powers copied them, notably the German Landsknechts, who built their entire doctrine on the Swiss model. With an irony history is rarely too polite to note under Habsburg patronage. Military historians describe the Swiss pike square as providing the model for the modern infantry regiment, a lineage that runs forward through the 16th century and beyond. But the legacy was not only military. The Pact of Brunnen held. Lucerne joined the Everlasting League in 1332, Zurich in 1351, Glarus and Zug in 1352, Bern in 1353. By the end of the 14th century, there was something on the map of Europe that had not previously existed, a political entity organized around mutual obligation between communities rather than around the authority of a lord, a king or an emperor. No monarchy, no hereditary ruler. The oath. Now, let us return to the question that opened this video. Why did Leopold's army fail? The answer is not cowardice. Habsburg knights were not cowards. They had trained for combat their entire lives and faced military opposition across Europe with considerable effectiveness. The answer is not numbers. A well-drilled cavalry force with room to operate can defeat much larger infantry formations in open battle. History is full of examples. The answer is what Leopold did not see. He looked at the road along Lake Egery and saw a route, a means of getting from Zug to Schwyz, a path through inconvenient terrain to a destination he had already decided on. The Swiss looked at the same road and saw a weapon, a mechanism, a physical constraint that would strip every advantage from their enemy and give every advantage to them. They saw what the road would do to a horse in a panic, what it would do to a column that could not turn, what it would do to knights in armor when the fighting happened at arm's length instead of cavalry charge distance. Leopold asked, "How do I get my army to Schwyz?" The Swiss asked, "Where does our enemy become helpless?" Those 2 questions produced 2 completely different relationships to the landscape. And on the morning of November 15th, the landscape rewarded one of them and punished the other without mercy. Today, the road along Lake Egery still exists. If you visit the area around Morgarten, you can stand at the approximate site of the engagement and look up at the Figlenfluh slope. A memorial chapel was built near the site in the centuries after the battle. A monument stands where the Swiss fighters gathered before the ambush. In November, when the canton of Schwyz organizes its annual commemoration, the ceremony is modest, more community gathering than military pageant. The road is narrower than you expect. That is the detail that stays with visitors. You read about the battle, you look at maps, you understand intellectually that the terrain was constrained, and then you stand there, and you look at the strip of ground between the slope and the water, and you understand viscerally why Leopold's army had nowhere to go. The intellectual knowledge becomes physical knowledge. The numbers and dates become a place. 700 years have passed since that November morning. The mountains are the same mountains. The lake is the same lake. The country built on the oath sworn in the aftermath. The country whose name derives from the word for people who swear together is still there too. One of the most stable, prosperous and peaceful nations in the world, without an empire, without a monarchy, without a history of conquest, built, at its foundation, on the decision of 1,500 farmers to lie still in the dark on a cold slope above a narrow road and wait for the sound of armored horses moving into the only place in the world where all that armor meant nothing. They did not know they were building a country. They were just trying to make it to spring. Edict logo.